Abandoned by my parents, I saved a shivering dog, and it saved me back. Growing up in a suburban middle-class family, you'd think my brother and I had it pretty good. And we did, at least on paper. We had the kind of life you'd expect from an average American family. A two-story house with a backyard big enough for summer barbecues. A garage packed with old holiday decorations and half-finished DIY projects my dad swore he'd get around to. My parents both worked steady jobs. My dad in insurance, my mom in healthcare. Weekends meant Costco runs where my mom filled a cart like we were stockpiling for an apocalypse, while my dad found an excuse to browse power tools he had no intention of buying. Holidays meant an explosion of Christmas lights visible from space, and a turkey so big it took 2 days to defrost. Sounds nice, right? Except, in our house, everything revolved around my older brother, Nate. Nate was a golden child, the undisputed favorite. And before you roll your eyes and think I'm just bitter, trust me, I wish I was exaggerating. But the reality was, Nate got away with things I wouldn't even dream of trying. If he bombed a test, my parents shook their heads and blamed the teacher. If I got anything less than an A, I was met with, well, maybe if you studied harder. Nate could come home at 2 a.m., and my parents would laugh it off. If I even hinted at staying out past 10, I got a full FBI-level interrogation about where, with who, and why. The worst part? Even when Nate messed up, my parents bent over backward to defend him. He got in trouble at school more times than I could count. Detentions, skipping class, a few incidents that were always brushed under the rug. But every time, my parents had an excuse. Boys will be boys, my mom would say. He just needs to find his passion. Meanwhile, if I so much as forgot to take out the trash, I was apparently on the fast track to being a complete disappointment. By the time we were teenagers, it was painfully clear Nate had all the freedom, and I had all the expectations. If Nate left his dishes in the sink, it was my job to clean them. If he borrowed my stuff and broke it, my parents said I should have known better than to lend it to him. If he bailed on a family event, it was fine. If I even thought about skipping, I got the whole family is everything lecture. And birthdays? Forget it. Christmas? Somehow that was the Nate show, too. One year, he got a brand new gaming setup, while I got a book on developing a strong work ethic. When I turned 16, I got a used bicycle. When Nate turned 16, my parents surprised him with a barely used Honda Civic, complete with one of those giant bows like in a car commercial. I swear, I thought those only existed in TV ads, but nope, they're real, and they're infuriating when you're not the one getting the car. I tried to be the good kid. I got good grades, worked part-time jobs, kept my nose clean. But none of that mattered because I wasn't Nate. By the time Nate was in college, my parents acted like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. He wasn't exactly acing his classes, but that didn't stop him from talking about how brilliant he was and how he just learns differently. Meanwhile, I was expected to get scholarships, work my way through school, and somehow figure out life with no safety net. And then, right before Nate's graduation, my parents dropped the biggest bombshell yet. They had already decided, without even asking, that he could live at home for as long as he wanted. No rent, no responsibilities. He just needs time to get on his feet, they explained, as if he was an endangered species that needed protection. I couldn't believe it. I was still in college myself, working part-time to pay for my own tuition, because my parents made it crystal clear they weren't covering my expenses. But Nate, he was getting a free ride, no questions asked. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't just favoritism. This was my parents making it loud and clear who actually mattered in this family. And I wasn't on that list. Turning 18 should have been a milestone, a celebration, maybe even a little bit of freedom. But for me, it was more like a countdown to disaster. A week after my birthday, my mom sat me down at the kitchen table. No warning, no build-up. Just me, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and a casual bombshell that flipped my world upside down. She told me it was time for me to be independent, not in the vague, motivational, spread your wings kind of way. No, she meant it literally. I had 2 weeks to pack my things and figure out where I was going. At first, I thought she was joking. I mean, Nate was 22, still living at home, his dirty laundry practically forming a second carpet in his bedroom, and no one seemed in a hurry to push him out the door. But me, the kid who never caused trouble, got decent grades, and worked part-time to pay for my own stuff, I was apparently a burden now. A few days later, I came home to find my things already packed. Cardboard boxes stacked by the front door like I was some kind of overnight Amazon return waiting for pickup. It was surreal. I didn't even get to decide what I wanted to take. They just went through my room and dumped whatever they thought was important into a few boxes. My clothes, my laptop, some toiletries. No sentimental items, no old childhood keepsakes, just the bare minimum. Years of my life, reduced to what could fit in the back of my rusted-out Honda. Meanwhile, in the driveway, parked like a shiny symbol of everything unfair in the universe, was Nate's brand-new Ford Mustang. Not used, not a hand-me-down, fresh off the lot, with that new car smell and leather seats, so pristine they might as well have still been wrapped in plastic. My parents had gifted it to him as a graduation present, except he hadn't even technically graduated yet. But hey, why let details ruin the party? I didn't say anything. What was the point? I just loaded my stuff into my car, an ancient, rust-speckled Honda I had bought with my own money, and drove off without looking back. I didn't even know where I was going. I had no savings, no backup plan, and definitely no parental support. After a few desperate Craigslist searches, I found a room for rent in a sketchy part of town. The kind of place where you learn pretty quickly to sleep with one ear open and never leave anything valuable in plain sight. The walls were thin enough to hear every argument happening 3 apartments down, and the plumbing made noises I'm pretty sure weren't normal. But it was cheap, and that was all that mattered. With rent to cover and no other options, I picked up 2 jobs. One at a 24-hour diner, the kind of place where the coffee is always burnt and the regulars tip in loose change. The other was overnight stocking at a grocery store. It was brutal. I barely had time to sleep, let alone think about what had happened. My dinners were usually whatever expired deli sandwiches the store let us take home, and my bed was a lumpy mattress that I found in a free stuff section on Facebook Marketplace. And my parents, they didn't check in. Not once. No calls, no texts, nothing. It was like I had been erased from the family the second I pulled out of the driveway. Nate, on the other hand, was thriving. Instagram posts of him road tripping in his Mustang, hitting up bars, living the dream. I wondered if he even noticed I was gone. If he did, he never said a word. I should have been angry. Maybe I was. But mostly I was just exhausted. Surviving on instant ramen and gas station coffee, juggling 2 jobs, dodging sketchy neighbors. It didn't leave a lot of time for bitterness. It was survival mode. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure I was going to make it. But giving up wasn't an option. If my parents had taught me one thing, it was that no one was going to look out for me. I had to do it myself. So I did what any broke, overworked, sleep-deprived 18-year-old would do. I kept my head down, kept grinding, and told myself that one day I'd be the one driving the Mustang. And when that day came, I wouldn't need their approval anymore. If there was any lingering doubt about where I stood in my family, social media erased it. Every time I scrolled, there they were, my parents and Nate, laughing over dinners at fancy steakhouses, taking weekend trips to Napa Valley, celebrating holidays like I had never even existed. Nate's life looked like a highlight reel from a movie, cruising down the highway in his Mustang, sunglasses on, posting captions about chasing dreams. Meanwhile, I was running on 4 hours of sleep, living off gas station hot dogs, and debating whether a pack of ramen could be stretched across 3 meals. Money was tight, too tight. Rent, bills, food. It felt like I was constantly on the edge of sinking. I worked every extra shift I could grab, but it never seemed like enough. Meanwhile, my parents were still bankrolling Nate. New clothes, trips, even paying for his car insurance. The guy hadn't held a real job in his life, yet somehow he was always flush with cash. The anger simmered every time I saw a new post. They didn't just cut me off, they erased me. At some point, I stopped checking their profiles. Seeing their perfect little life without me in it wasn't doing me any favors. One night, After a brutal double shift at the diner, I was walking home in the rain. My hoodie was soaked, my shoes squished with every step, and the only thing keeping me going was a promise of finally getting off my feet. As I passed the corner store, something small caught my eye, a tiny, shivering dog curled up under the flickering neon sign. It looked miserable, wet fur clumped together, ribs slightly visible, ears drooping like it had already given up on life. The kind of night where the cold seeped into your bones, and I knew it wouldn't last till morning if it stayed out there. I hesitated. The last thing I needed was another responsibility. But as I crouched down, the little thing looked up at me with these big, frightened eyes that felt a little too familiar. I sighed. "All right, buddy, let's go." I scooped the dog up, tucking it under my hoodie as I hurried the rest of the way home. My apartment wasn't much, just a shoebox with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen that doubled as a hallway. But it was warm. I wrapped it in the cleanest towel I owned, then dug to my cabinets for anything remotely dog-friendly. Scrambled eggs and a slightly stale piece of bread would have to do. The little guy inhaled the food, then curled up against my leg with a heavy sigh, like he had finally found a safe place. I knew the feeling. The dog, because I refused to call it mine at first, was small, scrappy, and tougher than it looked. It followed me around my tiny apartment like a shadow, hopping onto my mattress at night, curling up against my chest. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. I started calling it Buddy, mostly because it felt like the least creative name possible. I told myself I wasn't keeping him, that I'd find a shelter soon, but weeks passed, and I never did. One evening, while scrolling to the local Facebook marketplace for cheap furniture, a post in the community group caught my eye, a family looking for their lost dog. The photo was unmistakable. It was Buddy. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I had told myself I wasn't getting attached. But looking at that post, I realized I had been lying to myself the whole time. Seeing Buddy's picture in the online post hit like a punch to the gut. I had convinced myself I was just helping a stray, that I wasn't attached, that I was doing him a favor. But staring at that photo, seeing his same scruffy fur and big, trusting eyes on someone else's timeline, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He wasn't mine. I spent the next hour staring at my screen, debating what to do. Part of me thought about just ignoring it, keeping him, letting whoever lost him assume the worst. But that wasn't who I was. If I had been in their shoes, if I had lost something that mattered to me, I'd want someone to do the right thing. So, the next morning, I called the number on the post. The voice on the other end was soft, fragile even, like it belonged to someone who had been waiting too long for good news. Her name was Marjorie, and when I told her I thought I had found her dog, she went silent for a second, then let out a shaky breath. She asked if she could meet me that afternoon. I almost made an excuse. I almost hung up, but I couldn't, so I said yes. When I pulled up to the address she gave me, I expected a cookie-cutter suburban house, maybe some kids running around in the yard. Instead, I found a small, weathered bungalow on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that had been standing for decades and had more history than curb appeal. The yard was overgrown, a faded mailbox tilting to one side. I carried Buddy up the front steps, my stomach twisting. The door opened before I even knocked. Marjorie stood there, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her silver hair pinned back neatly. She was small, with that frail but tough look that only old folks seem to master. And the second she saw Buddy, her hands flew to her mouth, and she started crying. I barely had time to say anything before she took him from my arms, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. Buddy, who had spent the past few weeks glued to my side, wagged his tail like crazy, licking her face, whining with excitement. It was like he had been waiting for this moment as much as she had. She finally looked up at me, her eyes wet but warm. I thought he was gone forever. I told her how I had found him, curled up in the rain outside a store, how he had been scared and hungry. She listened, nodding, scratching Buddy behind the ears like she couldn't believe he was real. Then she invited me in. Her house was small but cozy, the kind of place that smelled like fresh-baked cookies and old books. The furniture was warm but comfortable, the walls covered in framed photos, most of them old, their edges curled from time. She shuffled into the kitchen and put on a pot of tea, moving slowly but deliberately, like she had done it 1,000 times. I hadn't planned on staying long, but then she started talking. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago. Her daughter, one so present in her life, had drifted away. Calls became texts, texts became silence. She didn't say it with bitterness, just matter-of-factly, like someone who had accepted their place in the world. Buddy had been her one companion, her last bit of real connection. When he went missing, she thought she had lost everything. I sat there, listening, drinking the tea she poured for me. It was strong, almost too strong, but I drank it anyway. There was something about her presence, something familiar. The loneliness in her voice felt too close to home. Before I knew it, hours had passed. And when I finally got up to leave, she patted my hand and asked if I'd come back sometime. I told her I would. And for the first time in a long time, I actually meant it. After that first visit, seeing Marjorie became part of my routine. It wasn't planned, not at first, but every time I passed her street, something made me slow down, then stop. At first, I'd check and just make sure Buddy was settling back in, but soon enough, it wasn't about the dog anymore. Marjorie and I became an unlikely pair. I helped her with groceries, fix the squeaky front door, and even figure out why her TV remote only worked when you smacked it twice on the coffee table. She never asked for much, and she hated feeling like she was putting anyone out, but I could tell she appreciated the company. She had this way of making a cup of tea feel like a whole event. She'd shuffle around the kitchen, moving slow but steady, setting out cookies on an old floral plate, like she was hosting a royal guest. The place smelled like cinnamon and something vaguely nostalgic, like a warm bakery that had been around forever. It was a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in a long time, and it kept me coming back. Over time, she started telling me about her life. Nothing overly dramatic, just small pieces of a life that had taken a few wrong turns. Her daughter, Laura, had cut ties with her years ago over money. Marjorie didn't go into detail, but I could tell it wasn't just about finances. The hurt ran deeper than that. She talked about how she used to visit Laura's kids, how holidays used to mean something, how one day the calls just stopped coming. I didn't say much, just nodded and listened, because I knew exactly what that kind of silence felt like. It wasn't lost on either of us how much our situations mirrored each other. I had been cast aside by my own parents, left to figure things out alone. She had been forgotten by the very people she raised. Two people, both unwanted in their own families, finding some strange kind of belonging with each other. One day, after fixing the leaky kitchen faucet, she handed me an envelope. Inside was $20. I laughed, handed it right back, told her I wasn't running a handyman service. She got that stubborn look in her eye, the one I was starting to recognize, and told me to take it anyway. "It's not for the work," she said. "It's for the company." I took the money, but later I left it on her counter when she wasn't looking. The months passed like that. I was still working 2 jobs, still scraping by, but my visits to Marjorie's house became something I looked forward to. She made me real meals, the kind that didn't come in a microwavable tray. She let me ramble about my awful shifts, shaking her head and muttering about how young people work too hard for too little these days. Buddy still greeted me like I was his favorite person in the world, even though I knew Marjorie was his real home. Then, 6 months in, everything changed. I had swung by after my grocery shift, expecting to find Marjorie in her usual spot by the window, reading one of her mystery novels. But something felt off the second I stepped onto the porch. The front door was unlocked. A half-folded newspaper lay on the welcome mat, untouched. Inside, the house was too quiet, too still. I called her name. No answer. Then I found her, collapsed on the floor by the kitchen table. Her tea mug shattered beside her. Buddy sat next to her, whining softly, as if he had been trying to wake her up. I didn't think. I just moved, dialed 911, checked for a pulse, felt the cold sweat break out on my back as I tried to remember every first aid step I'd ever learned. The seconds stretched into hours, and for the first time in a long, long time, I was terrified of losing someone again. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. I hated places like this. Too bright, too sterile, too full of people waiting for news they didn't want to hear. But here I was, sitting in a stiff chair next to Marjorie's bed, watching her chest rise and fall under the thin hospital blanket. She had been unconscious when the paramedics took her, barely clinging to awareness as they loaded her into the ambulance. The doctors said it was a stroke. Not a small one, either. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I wasn't family. I had no authority to make decisions. But when they asked if she had anyone to call, no one else came to mind. So I stayed. The nurses gave me weird looks when I showed up every day. They probably assumed I was a grandson or some long-lost relative trying to make up for lost time. No one questioned it, though, and I didn't bother correcting them. The truth was simpler and sadder. Marjorie didn't have anyone else. After a few days, she woke up, weak, disoriented, but still Marjorie. She blinked at me, then sighed like I was the most predictable thing in the world. "Of course you're here." She barely had the strength to speak, but she managed to tell me I had a good heart, that I reminded her of her late husband, how he always looked out for people, even when they didn't deserve it. I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't some saint. I was just a guy who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left, told me I was family, whether I liked it or not. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told her she was stuck with me. She didn't make it through the night. The next morning, I sat in the empty hospital room, staring at the neatly folded blankets on the bed, trying to process the fact that she was gone. No one came to claim her things. No grieving family. No long-lost daughter showing up at the last minute. It was just me and Buddy, standing in the doorway, feeling like ghosts in someone else's story. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, an old friend from church. I made sure she had flowers, that her name wasn't just another line in the obituary section of the paper. It felt wrong, how quietly the world moved on without her, like she had never been here at all. A week later, I was back to working double shifts, trying to keep myself too busy to think. Then I got the call. It was a lawyer. He sounded official, the kind of guy who probably wore expensive suits and had an office with one of those leather chairs that made you feel like you were about to be told you had unpaid parking tickets from 5 years ago. He asked me to come in, said it was about Marjorie. I almost told him he had the wrong guy, but something in my gut told me to go. Walking into the lawyer's office, I felt like I was about to get hit with some ridiculous fine I didn't know existed. Maybe Marjorie had left me an old sewing machine or a collection of ceramic cats. That would have made sense. What didn't make sense was a polished conference room I was sitting in, complete with mahogany furniture and a view of the city skyline. The lawyer, a guy in his 50s with a watch that probably cost more than my car, slipped folder across the desk. "Marjorie wanted you to have this." I opened it, expecting, well, I don't know what I expected. Maybe a sentimental note. Maybe instructions on how to take care of Buddy. Instead, I found legal documents. A lot of them. "She left you everything," the lawyer said, like he was telling me it might rain later. The words didn't compute. Everything? I flipped through the pages, my brain short-circuiting. A house. Not just any house. Her house. A solid 2-story place in a nice neighborhood. Fully paid off. $500,000 in a bank account I hadn't known existed. A plot of land outside of town that, based on some quick Google searches later, was worth even more than the house. I sat there, gripping the papers like they might disappear if I let go. "She wanted you to be taken care of," the lawyer added, adjusting his glasses. Said you were the only person who had been there for her when it mattered. It hit me then she had planned this. Marjorie had known. Maybe not exactly when, but she had known her time was running out, and she had made sure I wouldn't end up struggling the way I had before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't broke. I wasn't barely scraping by. Overnight, I had gone from a guy sleeping on a Craigslist mattress to a homeowner with a bank account. That didn't make me want to cry. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I felt like I'd been dropped into someone else's life. I left the office in a daze, barely remembering how I got home. Well, my new home. The house looked different now. less like Marjorie's and more like something I had to figure out how to live in. I spent the next few days adjusting, moving in my sad excuse for belongings, trying to wrap my head around the fact that I didn't have to stress about rent anymore. I even let Buddy pick a new favorite spot on the couch, like we were both trying to claim our space in this strange new reality. I stocked the fridge with actual food instead of just dollar store frozen meals. For the first time in forever, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, and yet I still felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then the problem arrived. I should have known the peace wouldn't last. I should have expected it, because when something this good happens, the universe has a way of making sure people find out. And my family, they found out. It started with a text from Nate. Dude, what the hell? You bought a house. I blinked at my phone, rereading the message like it would make more sense the second time. Bought? I hadn't bought anything. But then it clicked. He must have seen me coming and going. The house wasn't far from where my parents lived. Maybe a neighbor had mentioned it. Maybe had driven by and spotted me unlocking the door. And if Nate knew, that meant my parents did too. 2 hours later, my phone rang. My mom. I stared at the screen, knowing exactly where this was going. And I wasn't ready for it. I didn't pick up my mom's call. I just stared at my phone until it stopped ringing, then tossed it onto the couch like it was radioactive. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. Sure enough, 2 minutes later, a text popped up. We need to talk. Yeah, I bet we do. The next day, I got a knock at the door. I almost didn't answer. But Buddy started barking like he was auditioning for a home security commercial, and I wasn't in the mood for my new neighbors to start side-eyeing me. I opened the door, and there they were, my parents, standing on my new porch like they'd just casually dropped by for a cup of coffee. The last time I had seen them, they were boxing up my stuff and leaving it by the front door. Now, they were smiling like nothing had happened. My mom had that tight, forced grin she used when she wanted something, and my dad stood there awkwardly, hands shoved in his pockets like a kid who got caught doing something he shouldn't. We were in the neighborhood, she said. Yeah, right. They lived 20 minutes away, and this wasn't exactly on their way to Costco. I didn't invite them in. I just leaned against the doorframe, waiting. It didn't take long for them to get to the point. My mom started talking about family values, how we used to have Sunday dinners, how things had just been so difficult back then. They never actually apologized. Instead, they acted like time had magically erased what happened. Like kicking me out had just been a small misunderstanding. Then came the real reason they were here. Nate had blown through whatever money they'd been giving him. He had dropped out of college, couldn't hold down a job, and now, for the first time in his life, he was struggling. And, of course, my parents had been covering for him this whole time. They had stretched their finances thin, trying to keep him afloat. Now, they were looking at me, the son they hadn't cared about for years, because suddenly I was the one with the resources. I almost laughed. Almost. I let them talk, watching how carefully they chose their words, how my mom's voice softened when she tried to bring up second chances, how my dad nodded along like he agreed with every word she said. It was all an act. They didn't care about reconnecting with me. They cared about the house, about the money, and they thought I was still that kid desperate for their approval. I let the silence stretch before I finally spoke. I think you should go. My mom blinked like she hadn't heard me right. Honey, we just... No, I said. You left me behind when I had nothing. You don't get to come back now that I have something. She looked genuinely shocked. My dad sighed, shaking his head, like I was the unreasonable one. Nate would have thrown a tantrum, but he wasn't here. My guess? He was too embarrassed to show up himself, so he sent them instead. They tried one more time, but I didn't budge. Eventually, they left, walking back to their car in silence. I stood there, watching them drive away, waiting for the usual wave of guilt to hit me. But it never came. Instead, for the first time in a long time, I felt something else entirely. Free. The first check hit my bank account, and for a second, I thought it was a mistake. I had signed a lease agreement for the land, but seeing the actual money roll in felt surreal. The developers wasted no time breaking ground for the new shopping center, and just like that, my unexpected inheritance turned into a steady stream of income. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. At first, I didn't know what to do with the extra cash. I had spent so much of my life scraping by that the idea of having more than I needed felt unnatural. My first splurge? A really good mattress. Not that this was the cheapest thing on sale kind, but an actual brand name memory foam masterpiece. I slept like a king that night. The house felt more like home with every passing week. I repainted the kitchen, replaced the old curtains, and even fixed that loose step on the porch that Marjorie used to complain about. Buddy had officially claimed the best spot on the couch, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to stress about rent bills or whether I could afford a decent meal. I stocked the fridge with actual food, fresh vegetables, steak, fancy cheeses. I upgraded from instant coffee to the fancy ground stuff, bought a decent set of cookware, and even started meal prepping like some kind of responsible adult. Meanwhile, my parents were drowning. I didn't go looking for updates, but small towns love to talk. Nate had burned through his money, and my parents had maxed out their credit trying to bail him out. The lifestyle they had bankrolled for years had finally caught up with them, and now they were scrambling. The house they used to brag about, on the market. The expensive car Nate used to flex with, repossessed. A part of me expected them to come back, to try one last guilt trip, but they didn't. Maybe they finally got the message. Or maybe they were too ashamed to ask for help after I shut them down the first time. Either way, I wasn't losing sleep over it. With the house fully mine, I started making it my own. I got a grill for the backyard, and pretty soon, weekend barbecues became a thing. Nothing fancy, just a few burgers, some beers, and whoever happened to drop by. The neighbors warmed up to me fast. Turns out, free food is the quickest way to make friends. I also started traveling, not in a bougie, first-class kind of way, but enough to check out places I'd only ever seen in movies. I took Buddy on a road trip down the coast, stopping at every hole-in-the-wall diner we could find. He loved it. So did I. And the best part? I didn't have to answer to anyone. No parents breathing down my neck. No Nate rubbing his latest handout in my face. Just me, Buddy, and a future that actually looked good for once. I kept a framed photo of Marjorie on the fireplace mantel, one from years before I met her, when she was younger, happier. I like to think she'd be proud of how things turned out, proud that her home was still filled with life, that her dog was still spoiled, that the kid she had taken in off the street had finally found his place in the world. One night, as I sat on the porch, sipping a drink and watching Buddy chase fireflies in the yard, it hit me. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who's there when it matters. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had won